Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Making Sense of Learning and New Technologies. And this week we're going to explore a range of new technologies, in particular computer gaming, virtual worlds, learning management systems, and one other which I've forgotten just for the moment. What's our other one? Learning management systems and learning analytics. So hopefully you've had a chance to do some of those readings, and we'll delve into those and discuss the various aspects of those particular educational technologies. And we'll also do a run through again of your first assignment and what's involved in that, and the use of the 1000 Minds decision-making tool for doing your Delphi survey. But before we get started, are there any questions anyone has about anything from previous weeks?
All good.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, well, we might then jump into questions about the assignment. Do you have any specific questions that I can frame responses around? Otherwise, I'll just do a brief general overview. But if there's anything in particular that you want to ask or have got need some clarification on, I'm happy to address that in more detail.
No particular questions right now.
Okay, so Emma asks, do we need to do a connection circle and system model? I've done one each. Okay, good question, Emma. Normally, the connection circle is used for creating your system model. And it's an easy way of identifying the causal loops that you might use in a more complex stock flow diagram or computerized system model. Now, there's no actual specific requirements, although I'll check as we go through the assignment in a second, to do any particular form of system modeling. You just have to produce some sort of system model using whatever tools you decide upon. And they don't have to be the digital tools. You can do them on paper. The whole point of doing the systems thinking approach is to have you explore the various possibilities and interconnections of larger systems that could impact upon the specific system that you're exploring and coming up with your advice through around the Delphi survey. But that said, there are some marks allocated to doing an effective system model, and the tools can certainly help you do a better system model. But I'm not assessing you so much on your ability to use the tools, but on your ability to come up with a good system model. And is that Sarah that we have with us as well? Okay, I think we can hear you, Sarah, if that is you. I get, oh, wonderful, thanks. I do sometimes get confused with the Chinese names. I don't want to make mistakes, as I did with Eric last week. Okay, so let's have a look at the assignment. Oh, Sarah, do you have any specific questions about the assignment that you would like to ask before I go through it?
I think I'm still confused, a little bit confused about using the 1000 Minds.
Using the 1000 Minds tool?
Yeah, I'm still confused how to use it.
Yes, I'll go through that again tonight.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yes, it is conceptually difficult to get your head around because it works on criteria rather than on the technologies, but
yeah,
we'll go through that again in a second.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, but let's have a look at the assignment. And just to make sure everyone's reasonably clear on what's involved. So you've got a 3,000 word document that you're going to produce. It's fairly standard size assignment. And it's worth 40% of your overall grade. And it's got 5 steps. And if we look there, you'll see I've also broken those down into sections that would go onto your actual document. So first off, you need to analyze your particular organization. Now, that might be your classroom, or it might be a university or a school, and you can make up a lot of this. Okay, I'm not going to be going and checking to see whether or not your system model reflects your real classroom. That's not the point of the assignment. It's not to be an accurate representation of a real environment, but I do want to be able to see you go through the process as though you could use this in a real environment. So if you decide to do it on a country basis, or a system-wide basis, or an individual school basis, or an individual classroom basis, that's all fine. But you do need to construct a system model looking at all the different aspects that might interact with that organization. So who's got some ideas on what sort of things could interact with a classroom model? What other elements of a system would interact? Differentiation. Well, maybe let's identify then as the students would be an important element of any system model to do with, or any educational environment. And the fact that each student has their own strengths and weaknesses and perspectives and approaches that could be most beneficial to them, what we call differentiation, could be an important aspect of that. So yes, but you could also look at differentiation around the different strengths and weaknesses of teachers, or even of schools, or to that matter, even whole school systems, where we might have the Catholic system be having particular strengths in one area, the independent system having other strengths, the state school system having other strengths and weaknesses in different areas. So differentiation doesn't have to just rely upon individual students. And indeed, differentiation could be applied to countries if you're looking at a global educational network. And yes, the pedagogy being used is certainly something that could be included and should be. That's an important aspect, and how teachers are engaged with the process of teaching. But again, that could be on a classroom level or a national level. Whole nations sort of have a particular pedagogical focus, as we see with particular emphasis on pedagogy in countries such as Finland or Singapore at the moment, while other countries have got very much more a tradition of direct instruction. So yes, they're all aspects, but there's lots of different things that could be influencing a classroom. There could be a whole lot of aspects around the parents, might be the socio-economic status of the catchment area for the students. It could be the wealth of the country or the wealth of the community that's supporting a school. It might be the time of year. That could be an important factor around various decision makings. So the idea is for you to think about all the different influences on your particular educational environment. Now, don't go overboard, because there literally could be thousands. You wouldn't be expected to do more than 10 or 20 at most. And one of the quickest ways of doing this, as we looked at in week 2, is to draw a connection circle, where you put all these aspects around the outside of a circle, and then you draw lines showing some interrelationship between them. And then as those lines form loops, you can identify causal loops, and then you may break those out and turn them into stock flow diagrams and try to understand those loops in more detail. And if you wanted to take it to the extreme, you could try to combine all of your causal loops into one large interrelated system model. But the main aspect of what we want to see from the system modeling is that you've thought about the different interconnections. And you're not just considering a classroom as a teacher and the student, but that there's lots of other influencing factors around any educational environment. And you could engage with some of the aspects of technology in that. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that first section?
Okay, so Jason, the first section just about the system thinking, and just like what you said, make a circle and lines and connecting each element together, and not only students and teachers, but the other elements. Is it
Yes, well, that's a tool you could use. What I'm particularly interested in, though, is your system model, okay? And your understanding of the complexity of the educational environment. And you can detail that you've used a particular tool to assist you in that, but how you've used the tool is not what will be assessed. It's the outputs, what you've actually achieved through using the tool, which is the focus.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and from that, then you should be able to identify some challenges. So there'll be a range of particular challenges that should be clear from the system model are particularly important for your particular environment. And one of those might be differentiation, as Emma brought up, or it might be the pedagogy that's being used. And you may be able to then see from your system model that technology has an influence on differentiation and the pedagogy being used. And you might be able to then, well, as we'll see a bit later, look at then, okay, what technologies might be best to support differentiation. And that may then help inform the questions that you ask of your experts in your Delphi survey. Now, that's just one possibility. There could be lots of other possibilities that you identify from your system modeling as to the particular challenges and key aspects that might be influential in there. Now, because this course is about technology, we would expect you to have some focus on the technology aspects of your systems, and some of the challenges should hopefully be supported by the introduction of technologies. So that's the next section where you identify some of the challenges facing your organization. And from those challenges, you should be able to develop the questions that you're going to ask. Of course, you're really using your experts to provide you with informed advice about these challenges. So from your system analysis, you should identify 3 challenges that face your selected organization and research those and come up with the technologies and the other aspects around those challenges, and develop the 10 questions that your experts are going to provide you advice on. Now, then you identify your 10 experts and you conduct your Delphi survey. Yep, and you can explain how that happened and the results of that survey. That's sort of the next sort of 400 words. And then you explain what advice those experts have now provided you in relation to those challenges. So the experts are going to rank the criteria, and you're going to be able to identify some various aspects of the questions that you've asked. And from that, you'll then be able to say, okay, the experts have suggested that these are the most important things that need to be addressed in the organization in order to address the challenges that were identified from the system model. So that's what the first 1,000 words of your assignment is really about. Actually, 1,500 words.
Excuse me, Jason. For question 4, it says manage 2 rounds. I remember last time you said just 1 round is enough.
Yes, that's correct. Because the tool now makes it a little bit easier, you don't need to do 2 rounds of Delphi survey. You should be able to achieve a good consensus with just a single round. So you don't need to do 2 rounds for this assignment, as I mentioned last week.
Thank you.
Yep. You do need to have the 10 questions. You may find that you don't get a really good result from the first round, so you can always then do a second round if you wish, but the tool doesn't rely upon having to have 2 rounds. It's a better tool than what we used to use, so it's a little bit easier to address things in that case. Okay, then the second part of the assignment is really you take what you've found out and what the experts have advised you on, and you create 2 possible scenarios of what's going to happen in your educational environment. Now, generally, they are best case and worst case scenarios. If everything goes really well and all the things that you've suggested are put into place, this is what the organization will look like in a certain period of time. I don't think I've specified how long you've got to have as that period. So you could make it in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. It's up to you. But you do need to do two different surveys, two different scenarios. One if things go one particular pathway, one if things go another pathway. They don't have to be really positive and really negative. You could just have two different pathways. If the school decides or the organization decides to implement one-to-one, this is what the organization could be like in 10 years' time. If the school decides to, instead of opting for a one-to-one laptops scheme where the school provides all the laptops, they might opt to go for a BYOD program. And what would the school be like in 5 years' time if they implemented a BYOD program instead? So that's the idea of the two scenarios. And then finally, you wrap it up with a reflection on how well those scenarios have reflected the decision-making process related to the system model. So how well you now understand the system from having gone through this process. Has it improved your understanding of the system itself and the possibilities that may develop over time in that system? So that's where you need to reflect upon what the process has developed in your understanding of the system. Okay, any questions? So there's really those two sections, well, three sections. One is your system model and the challenges faced to the system or the organization that you've identified in the system model. Your survey, which is getting experts' opinions on the questions that have fallen out of your understanding of the system. And then the two scenarios, which are where you take the understanding you have from the experts and you extrapolate them into the future down two different pathways to think through what may occur over a period of time. I understand it's all quite new to you and all these little aspects are things you may not have done before, but they're all relatively simple steps in themselves.
Excuse me, Jason, is the last one usefulness of predictions? It's just about reflection. Okay.
Yes, it's your reflection on how these approaches, the system modeling, the surveying, and the future prediction process have helped you understand your organization.
Okay.
And you could do a little bit in there too on how it might help you in decision making in your organization. So if you were the principal of the school, how could this process help you in making better decisions for your school? Or if you were the teacher in a classroom, how could these sort of processes help you in your decision making for your classroom? Or if you're running the education system for your country, how could these systems processes help you in making decisions about what changes to make to your country's education system, particularly when it comes to the implementation of technology?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Don't forget to have a look at the rubric. Of course, this then gives you a bit more detail on what's actually being assessed. Let me just make sure you're seeing that. No, you're not. 1 second. So the rubric is how you're assessed against, and for each criteria, there's 3 levels. So the complexity of the system model that you've developed and how it's provided you with some insight into your organization and the subsystems involved. Your choice of experts and how you've managed the process of doing the survey to make some predictions. Your analysis of what you've researched around your topics and how you've used the Delphi survey results and so forth to develop your scenarios. And your evaluation. Okay, how you've reflected upon the use of these processes as a decision-making tool, and in particular, how you reflected upon the process of doing the Delphi survey.
And just how many references at least we need to have?
There's no specific references or number of references required. Okay, the essential nature of referencing is you want to avoid plagiarizing. So any reference, any material that you've used that is the result of someone else's work, you need to reference and acknowledge that it's their work and not your work. So it really depends upon how many other people's resources you've included into your writing and the work that you've used. The only caveat I'll give on that is you don't need to reference my work, okay, in terms of the notes on the course page and so forth. If it's a particular document, such as, say, the Horizon reports, then yes, you should reference those, but you don't need to reference the course website and other things like that. I can clearly see when it's my work or your work in that case. But anywhere where there could be confusion as to whether or not it's your work or someone else's work, then you should reference. And ideally, you should reference correctly. There are no specific marks for your referencing ability in this course. We're not teaching you how to reference and do those sort of things, but it's just an important aspect of you not being subject to plagiarism by not referencing people's work when you should have referenced it. Does that make sense?
Sorry, my network was very poor just now for 30 seconds. So I didn't listen. I didn't hear it.
Okay. Essentially what I said was there's no specific marks for referencing, but you need to reference anyone's work that you include that is not your work. So if there is any confusion as to whether or not you've plagiarized someone else's work by not referencing them, you need to avoid that by making sure you reference.
Thank you, Jason. Got it.
Okay, any other questions about the assignment? The other key aspect, of course, is when it's due. And you'll see it's due on the 21st of August at 5 p.m, which is a Sunday.
Yeah, it should be Sunday.
Yes, it is. Okay, then. Well, if there's nothing else on the assignment, we'll get into the course material for this week. I won't embarrass you by asking you whether or not you've read the material. I'll just hope and trust that you have. Okay, so there's 4 elements of course material from this week. The first is on educational gaming. Has anyone done anything with educational gaming, the use of computer games or other games to support students' learning, or in classes, or you've ever had any experience of using games in classes or lectures or learning environments? So Emma's used The Sims a little bit. And The Sims is a computer game where you've got a simulation of a family that lives in a home, and they interact and have to buy food and furnish their home and have jobs and so forth. But there's about 100 different Sims games, probably 30 or 40 related to the Sims franchise itself, one of which is where the Sim character goes off to university and they have to manage getting a dorm room and attending classes and doing extracurricular activities outside of study and all those aspects of going to university. But essentially they're simulations. They simulate some aspect of life, and they can be a useful learning tool because students can engage with them and practice a whole lot of different experiences without necessarily having to go through the real world experiences. So for example, there's a sim one where they go on a date, and all the different aspects of getting ready for the date and going on a date and all the elements involved in dating are explored through the use of a simulation. But likewise, there are ones for going on a vacation, planning out the vacation and what to do on the vacation and how to look after your passports and visas and working out where to go and have fun and all those other aspects of going on vacations. And yes, very useful for developing fundamental life skills, but some simulations can be very complex. One of the most popular ones is called Simcity, where students actually take on the role of managing a city council with all the planning processes and rezoning and construction and road approvals and all the other elements involved in, yes, Eric, that's what we're talking about, Simcity, and even facing natural disasters and even some unnatural disasters. So very, very complex simulations, but made simple because they're being put into a game-like environment. And yes, sometimes they can take a long time, and that is one of the challenges for using simulation games in a school environment, but not all simulation games are designed to take a long time. It's just most commercial games are designed around about 100 hours of gameplay because people want to get value out of their purchases of a computer game. And if the game is completed too quickly, it's not likely to be a commercial success. But that said, there are a lot of educational simulation games that do take a lot shorter periods of time. Has anyone else played or know of any other types of educational games or games that could be used in education?
Yeah, while I taught at a school, I asked my students to play a game. Is actually a kind of software. So students can type on the keyboard to spell English words according to some hints. I asked them to have a computation just like that, you know. So the group which can type, which can get the English words as many as possible in 1 minute, so we'll be winning.
Yes, and that's an example of what we call gamification, where we take some elements of gameplay and we introduce it into another environment that's not necessarily a game. In this case, a typing tutor or a word, getting the right English words pronounced correctly or structured correctly. So in itself, it may not be a game, but it introduces game elements around competition or scoring or getting recognition for success that you would find in many computer games, and are used to help engage the students with the learning experience. Now, Emma mentions Kahoot. Emma, do you want to explain Kahoot a little bit? Yes, many things are banned in Education Queensland. Yes, essentially it's a student response system. We mentioned those last week, where students are presented with questions and then they provide responses to those questions. And a game, it introduces game-like elements, what we call gamification, to make that a more engaging, fun process. So it has a countdown timer that sort of raises the pressure on students, and it will give a score of who answered things correctly and show those up in a league table and all those elements that make the interaction more engaging for people rather than just answering some questions or putting up their hands and being asked to respond to a question in that way. So yes, there's lots of those gamified tools. Now, what I did want to try to steer you towards is some of the theory behind gaming and gamification in educational environments. So I'll just take you into some of that. Some of it gets a little bit deep fairly quickly, but this is a master's level course, so I did want to sort of show you a little bit of what's possible with gaming and gamification. So here's the document that you were to hopefully read around educational gaming. And one of the first aspects is you need to understand the concept of play. Play's had a resurgence in early childhood education, but it's a very important aspect of gaming. And the idea is, yes, computer games can be engaging, but we want to actually understand why they're engaging and why it's also a useful learning process. And the whole nature of play and how play is very much linked to the learning process, where young children do a lot of their learning through play, as do animals and other processes like that, where it could be very social or imaginative or storytelling or bodily, where moving around and interacting and so forth, but all form elements of play. And most games rely upon the elements of play in order to make them engaging and fun to play. So there's a fair bit of theory there about the idea of play and how we can actually incorporate play into learning, and the different forms of play, where it can be competitive or based on chance or based on role play and mimicry. They're the sort of the last one is just what's called Linux, it's where things are just out of control type play, where you might be spinning around or just running around crazily. But all different types of play that students can engage with. And then you've got various researchers love to categorize things. So we've got different categories of daydreams and fantasy as one type of play. Solitary play, like playing with your pet, or reading, or building cars, or doing crossword puzzles, is all another type of play. Having rules and working with other people to sort of do something together is another form of play. Then you've got jokes and being creative. So lots of various aspects of play. Just the main thing is for you to understand that play can be very complex. There's many different aspects of play. It's not just kids having fun. There's lots of ways you can play and different types of play. And indeed, many of these ways we can incorporate into our learning. Then you've got this concept of rhetorics of play. This is sort of the different ways we can go about play. This starts getting a bit more complex in terms of philosophy, but where play can be seen as fatalistic, and a lot of our mythologies are based on our lives being determined by random chance or by gods or destiny. But play can also be seen as a process of power, where we can have control over what we're doing and maybe control over others, where we're having some form of achievement in play, being the winner, or sometimes just being the loser, and a lack of control and a lack of power. Then there's a whole aspect around identity and who we are, and a lot of our play is around taking on roles, like being a doctor or a spaceman or a cowboy. And these aspects of taking on other people's roles and exploring what it would be like to be someone else. And that leads into the imaginary aspects of play, where we try to imagine different worlds and different spaces, Imagine going to the moon or being a star in a TV show, and all those aspects of play. And then there's aspects around ourself and how we can sort of use play just as a process of having fun and relaxing and escaping from the real world. And the final element of play in terms of rhetoric is the frivolous play, where we're just being absurdly fun. And this is sort of epitomized by the fool in historical courts, where the fool was allowed to do anything, even to the king, and play tricks and make the king look foolish, simply because they recognized the value of someone being completely frivolous, and having the freedom to interact with the king and anyone else in the court without any penalty being applied to them, when anyone else would have their head lopped off for doing a similar thing. But all those are different aspects that we can incorporate into play. Any questions on those aspects before we move on? Now, you don't need to understand all of this in detail unless it was one of the areas that you were going to explore in terms of the technologies for your assignments. But a lot of schools are exploring the use of computer games and other games in education and framing it around some of the transformative processes. Of course, it can have a big effect on pedagogy, particularly in the younger years when play is an important aspect of the learning processes, but also for our older students, where we tend to have lost the elements of play in learning, and the advantages of reintroducing some of that can have a profound effect on the learning environment. Play has always been a major part of young people's learning, but we tend to downplay and ignore it in the senior schooling. And there's a move to try to reintroduce some of that because of the advantages historically of play being a fundamental part of the learning process. Okay, so there's lots of principles as well around play, and you can read some of those as you will. So I mentioned before this concept of gamification. This is where we take elements of gaming and we incorporate it into other processes, which might be advertising. You see a lot of gamification in advertising where, say, one example would be the McDonald's Monopoly game, where each time you buy a purchase from McDonald's, you receive a little token that could represent a property on a Monopoly board. And if you complete enough of those, then you win prizes and have opportunities to go into draws to get larger prizes. So they're taking elements of playing a game and incorporating it into the purchasing process for that store. And there's many other places where we can incorporate gaming into non-gaming environments. Does anyone else have any examples? I'm talking too much. You guys need to talk. Words with friends. Yes, that's a good one, Emma, although that's probably an example really of a game rather than gamification, because that's really a specific board game, much like Scrabble, and it's been digitized and made available so people could play remotely together over the internet. So not necessarily an example of gamification, but certainly a good example of gaming. Any other examples where you've seen or used elements of games in everyday life?
I didn't play this kind of game very much because in China we also play the cards.
That's okay. Cards is certainly a very popular form of gaming. So one example might be there are some insurance companies now that give you a discount if you also have gym membership. So that's an example of gamification where you receive a reward for doing certain things. And some companies have even gone to the extreme where you might be given a little fitness device that you wear on your body, and the more exercise you get, you get benefits to your premiums. And the same with healthcare companies. So if you get health insurance, you may also, as part of that, get gym membership or other things that improve your ability to be healthier, use premiums. So they're sort of all elements of gaming where you collect all those various aspects and get rewards for them. A very popular form of gaming or gamification would be the badges that you earn in the Boy Scouts or Girl Guides. And indeed, that's now being taken into the digital space where you can earn badges for doing professional development or online courses or other things. And you build up a collection of these badges, and sometimes the badges can combine to get even more powerful badges and things of that nature. Did anyone get involved in the Pokemon Live craze that swept the nation a few months ago? No, you didn't get involved in that, Emma? That's okay, neither did I, not on that one. Although I am a big advocate of augmented reality and some of those technologies. This one, you used your mobile phone and you could go to various locations, and by looking through your mobile phone, you would see whether or not there were these animated characters living in these various locations, and people could then collect these Pokemon and build up various collections of Pokemon and then play Pokemon against each other, and there's a whole ecosystem around that particular game. It started off as a card game and then was turned into a TV show or animated TV series that supported the card game, which made it very popular, and has now morphed into movies and these augmented reality experiences and other processes. Okay, so that's gamification. Let's have a little look at the theory. Okay, now another aspect is when we start using gamification and computer games for what we call non-recreational purposes. And in our context, we're particularly focused on education. So how we could use games to support learning. And when we do this, we tend to call it serious play, as opposed to other forms of non-serious play. Although it is arguable that all forms of play are in many respects non-serious, but never mind. So there's various elements you can sort of read about in terms of different types of use of gamification in games. Advertising is a very popular one. Edutainment is where we have an aspect of education and entertainment combined. Game-based learning is where we have specific games developed for use by students. The edu market is where we have other games such as The Sims and SimCity that can be used in education. And there's also some popular ones such as Food Force, where students learn about healthy eating and buying food and combining foods to make a good meal. Then you've got news games and what we talked about before, simulations. So there are a range of different types of games that are commonly used in education, but we've got others such as persuasive games, which are trying to convince you of something. So an example of that would be around games like sun safety games. We're trying to promote students wearing hats and sunscreen and so forth. Or there's quite a few games around the appropriate use of alcohol and engaging with alcohol in that way. There's games that can help organizations work better together, work better as a team and so forth. Games for health, which we talked a little bit about, but you can do various games to promote health. Exercise games, That's quite popular with health and PE at the moment, where they're incorporating games that encourage exercise. And I'm involved in a global challenger game at the moment where we're all wearing little devices that measure our steps. And we're in a team of university academics that are ranked against all these other teams all around the world, counting how many steps we take. But there's also games in terms of the arts and lots of other areas where we can use games. Okay, the last bit I'll just leave you to read if you wish to get involved in a bit more theory about use of games. This is an area of research I do in terms of secondary worlds. The idea came from J.R.R. Tolkien, who created the Lord of the Rings series. And the idea of secondary worlds is where students can actually imagine themselves in the world that has been created by an author or a movie maker. And so, for example, students might imagine that they're in the world of Harry Potter. Now, the idea of this is that they don't just imagine that they're a character in the Harry Potter story, but that they could be another character that's not written about. And that character could move about and go to various places and have adventures and do things in this imaginary world that is created. And what then develops is this concept of co-creation, where the students can start adding to that world. And some students go to the extreme of doing their own artwork or creating their own maps and even creating their own stories that extend and build out the world that was created by the original author. And yes, very much used to promote creative thinking. Now, where computer games come into play is the co-creation process can be enhanced when the world is simulated in a computer game. Because now students can actually start physically creating in that space. And other people can also then visit that imaginary space that the students have helped create and engage and interact with that secondary world that they're working on. And you can have lots of people all working together on secondary worlds. So, for example, the Middle-earth, which is the Lord of the Rings secondary world, there's quite a lot of those, and players have built whole new continents full of places to visit and people to interact with. Role-playing games and things like that build very much upon this concept, but computer games now make it very easy, particularly very easy to use games such as Minecraft, where students can build and create their own countries and buildings, spaceships, and whatever else they want to build within these environments, and then imaginatively play out adventures and characterizations within these spaces. And yes, scientific movies do often, and science fiction, often provide lots of rich environments for secondary worlds because they are worlds that are different to our real world. The whole point of secondary worlds is it does have to be a fantasy or imaginative space where students can, or players can create very different opportunities to explore and do things rather than just what they would do in the real world. But there's lots of opportunities for learning through that process. And some of the concepts that I did want to bring out is that there's no one specific form of gamer. There's actually lots of different types of gamers. So you've got some students that hate shoot 'em up games, but might love doing puzzle games or word games, while other students would hate doing word games, but would love doing the simulation games. And there's different types of gamers, and likewise, there's many different types of games and so forth. But the last bit we'll talk about in terms of games is the idea of sim school. This is a simulation of a classroom where you've got a class of up to 30 students, and as a teacher, you make decisions as to how you interact with that class. Do you present some content? Do you have an activity? Do you do some question and answering? And by engaging with these simulated students, they interact back with you, and there's a whole lot of metrics that can be used and applied, and you can then go back and analyze how effective you were as a teacher to differentiate your instruction, to meet the needs of all the different students, to keep them engaged and occupied, to have a good variety of activities, and all the things that we would hope a good teacher does in a classroom environment. So this is a process whereby we can help teachers learn to become better teachers through the use of a computer game that lets them try out lots of different approaches and see when they're doing things successfully and when they're doing things unsuccessfully. So yes, very useful for undergraduate studies, but also useful for more experienced teachers too, particularly in engaging them with differentiation and some of the challenges of trying to address the needs of lots of students in a classroom. Okay. Any other questions about computer games and gamification or secondary worlds? Okay, it's one specific area of educational technology, but a very popular and powerful one that some teachers and students like to get involved in.
It's a very interesting topic, especially boys like it very much.
Yes, certainly boys do like some types of games very much, but girls also play games just as much as boys. They do often have different interest in the types of games, although there are plenty of crossovers amongst all the genres. But boys do tend to like certain types of games, while girls tend to like other types of games, particularly the more role-playing, social engagement type games where you work collaboratively and solve challenges, while boys tend to like the more technical simulation, war game simulation type games. Okay, so now let's get into the next topic, which is around virtual worlds and virtual spaces. This is a little bit different to computer gaming, although it does have some similarities. So this is an image of a virtual world that I created for Griffith University about 10 years ago. And you had avatars, which is, we're sort of seeing the back of my avatar there, who could move around. Yes, very much like virtual reality, although you don't necessarily have to wear a virtual reality headset. Virtual reality headsets do make it more immersive, but virtual worlds were designed so that you could just engage with them with a computer screen. So you didn't necessarily need to have the full three-dimensionality of a virtual reality headset. But virtual worlds were set up and they had a lot of advantages similar to this experience we're having of online interaction, where in a virtual world, and indeed I used to run this course inside a virtual world, you would arrive and, let me see if I got a picture of it. And so here's myself and one of my students, and we're working together on creating some objects in that virtual space. I think I've got, so here's a classroom in a virtual space where each of these is an individual person that's online, and you've got a teacher talking away. And I think I've got some pictures of, no, I don't. But in this virtual world, you could all gather together in various spaces. Oh, here we are. This is where I used to run this course. And in fact, this was a group of students in this course, all seated around a virtual table. And we could then chat with each other. And you could use your voice to speak, or you could type, and the typing would appear above people's heads. So a different type of engagement to online teaching and learning, but another approach to online teaching and learning using a different environment other than video conferencing or a learning management system. There were other advantages, though, in that you could go on excursions. So this was the Griffith University virtual space, sort of themed around a rainforest theme and so forth. But there are other ones, such as this is one for a space center where you can go and actually look at all the different rockets and things of that nature. But there are lots of virtual worlds. There's a whole lot of them for children. Club Penguin is actually one of the world's biggest virtual worlds, and it has about, I think at any one time, there's about 1 million students in there. Very simple virtual world with lots of little games, but a virtual world nonetheless. And some of the uses of virtual worlds is Machinima, where people act out stories. So students could act out, say if they're reading Macbeth, they could change all of their avatars to be the different characters in that story, and they could then move around. They could build the set for their story, like the castle and the moors and where the witches are and all that sort of rest. And then they could move around reenacting the story using their virtual characters. And filming that and making a movie of that is called Machinima, where you make a movie using a computer game or virtual world, and normally you put voiceovers over the characters moving around. So Second Life was probably the largest virtual world. It's sort of become less popular over the years, but it was a very, very large virtual world and space that people could visit, including they had educational ones. Opensim was a more recent version of that, and there's been a number of new ones since then. Active Worlds was set up particularly for K-12 students, and it had several variations. The main one was Quest Atlantis, where students aged 9 to 16 could do a whole lot of learning activities. So there'd be ones there where they would go off and explore the inside of a cell or the inside of a heart, and actually move through the heart and explore what it would be like in terms of how it all works and all the rest. Or they could go off and explore various storytelling activities. So there'd be a whole range of books that were framed around different topics. So there was one around the plague and medieval Europe. A lot of historical reenactments are done, like what it would be like to visit ancient China, or the Barrier Reef, or the pyramids. And being able to move around them is similar to watching a movie, but more engaging, because you can actually move in and explore things and interact with things more than you can with just a video. So do we have any questions about virtual worlds? I did used to take everyone into them, but it takes a while to actually set it all up, and by the time we actually iron out all the technical issues people have, we normally run out of time to actually do anything effectively engaging in virtual worlds. But if you do get over the technical glitches, then they can become very engaging, particularly as we're now moving into use of more virtual reality technologies in schools. And this is where we use a headset, and students can then look around the virtual spaces and explore them in a little bit more detail than just with moving around with a mouse and a computer screen. Questions or suggestions of where virtual worlds might be useful? Or is everyone gone to sleep?
I was still here right now. After listening to your explanation about the virtual world, I found it so interesting, and it's a very potential field for education learning. And maybe sometimes students can stay at home and they just have a class with a headset at home and just have a whole day class.
Correct. And indeed, a few years ago now, we had a big flood in Brisbane, and there were a number of university courses that, well, the university campuses were all closed, and there were a number of university courses that we were able to continue by using virtual worlds instead of having the students attend on campus. Now, they do have similar capabilities to video conferencing and things of that nature, but the virtual world is a little bit more engaging because, for one thing, if students stop moving around and doing things, their actual avatars fall asleep. So it's quite easy to see whether or not you're actually still there and paying attention. While here in video conferencing, unless you turn your video on, I can't tell whether or not you're actually still present and engaged with the learning process. So there's those little aspects, plus the whole idea of being able to move around and go and do things together is quite a different experience to just interacting through the video chat system and the video conferencing system. And young students love them because it is very much more gamified. They see it as a computer game to many extent, and it just has that element of extra engagement. Okay, now we'll jump back into something a little bit more familiar to you, which is learning management systems. So who can give me an example of a learning management system before we get into it? Let's get you doing some stuff. Get some active thinking happening. Or active learning, as they say it. Okay, examples of learning management systems. Tools such as software used to help manage the learning process. Or as I like to call them, learner management systems. Yes, blogs can be used, probably not commonly used as a learning management system, but they could be used certainly as part of a learning management system. Now, you all use a learning management system here at Griffith University. Does anyone know what it's called? Yes, Emma, One School is an example of a learning management system. And yes, Blackboard is the learning management system, or Learning at Griffith, as we call it here at Griffith University. Or you may call it My Griffith. There's various names for it. And indeed, I'm off to a meeting on Friday where we're going to discuss what the next learning management system for Griffith University will be, and whether or not we'll stay with Blackboard or My Griffith or so forth. But yes, Education Queensland uses a range of learning management systems. The Learning Place is the main one, and One School is an element of that space as well. So the whole idea of a learning management system is for you to be able to control and monitor and manage. More often it's the dispersal of information or access to information and resources, but it could also be the facilitate communication and a range of other elements. One of the key aspects that we use it for at university is to collect assessment tasks. So instead of having assignment boxes where you had to print out your assignments and put them into boxes around campuses, now we can have you submit to a digital box and submit your assignments online through a learning management system. So what advantages does the assignment collection process have when it's used through a learning management system? Okay, accuracy. How would it be more accurate, Emma? Yes, absolutely. We can utilize a whole lot of plagiarism detection software, and Griffith Uni uses 2 different plagiarism detection pieces of software to look at all the submitted assignments and see whether or not they've been there's too much copying from other assignments or other resources on the internet. And yes, the efficiency of collection of assessment, it does make it much easier because we can then, it's fairly easy to set up a digital box, and indeed that's all done centrally, and we don't have to worry about going and putting names on boxes and going and remembering to collect the assignments from those boxes and so forth. And yes, Eric, it does have the ability to provide feedback to students. So instead of now having to write on the actual pieces of paper, we can write on the digital documents, and students can have access to those almost immediately, rather than having to wait until they were provided back, normally several weeks or months after they submitted their assignment. Yes, access to course material as a general aspect of learning management systems, absolutely. And it's easy for online students who cannot access the physical library. And that's normally, or certainly within a course, academics often do provide a lot of resources. The integration with an actual physical library and getting access to digital documents is also facilitated through our digital collection of documents that are made available to students when they've got to be under restricted processes where we can't just make any copies of them. And yes, good, Eric, sharing of ideas and having discussions is often also facilitated through learning management systems. Okay, so we're starting to get some good elements of the learning management system. Let's pop in and look at some of the theory. Okay, so we've got virtual learning environments. So this is where we have things such as coming together as a group, as a class, having online tests, distributing homework, being graded and having your assessments submitted, and access to resources. So many of the elements that you mentioned. And these can be done synchronously or asynchronously. At the moment, we're doing something synchronously, or for most of us. Those that will be looking at this later as a video recording will be doing it asynchronously. So if we meet live and are doing things all together at the same time, that's known as synchronous engagement. When we do it at our own pace and our own time and different times, that's asynchronous. Okay, and we've got various learning management systems that help us manage these different processes. They often make it easy to administer the course, and particularly from year to year, replicating the course and enrolling students and all those back-end elements, assigning email addresses and all the other administrivia. They permit teachers to manage the process. So some courses release material slowly, so you only get to see the material for that week and you can't sort of read ahead. Or some courses are set up so that you have to complete various elements before you can move on to the next element, a bit like this course, where you don't get access to the next module until you've done your the quiz, and it then releases you to the next section. They do let you do things more quickly. You can assemble course material and content and distribute it to students much more rapidly than when we had to do lots of photocopying and overhead projection sheets and all the rest. And they put everything together in one location. This is one thing students particularly like, because they know that they go to the one website and all the material is there. They also make it portable and allow us to share things. So I could share my course with another lecturer at this university or another university, and they could turn it into a course to use for themselves a lot easier than when we had physical resources that we had to manage and look after. And we can personalize content and reuse it. So we can take the content from lots of different locations, organize it how we want it, have it organized, and present it to students, rather than have you just go off to someone else's website and engage with the content, how it's being presented by the authors of that content. We can remix and repurpose content into ways that we feel is more beneficial to our students. So they're all elements of what learning management systems can do. Now, they also have an element of what's called a content management system. This is where we restrict and make resources available. So you may have it so that only students in a particular course can get access to certain documents and worksheets and quizzes and those sort of things. And quite a bit of learning management systems are set up to do that, to restrict things down to just people that are enrolled in particular courses. So any other elements of a learning management system that anyone wants to mention or can think of? Okay, so any benefits you've found from a learning management system? Have you found Learning at Griffith a particularly useful tool? And if so, why? Or why not?
It's very convenient to get access to the resources, and it's very quick to contact teachers and the other resources.
Yes, that's a good point around being a process of communication and being able to contact people. Sarah, do you have any experiences of learning at Griffith, or what did you call it? My Griffith?
Yeah, it's Learning Griffith. because normally if I want to know how many class I'm going to have next week, I will check Learning Griffith first, because the timetable will be showing in the right side of Learning Griffith. Yeah, and if I want to check my previous learning courses, I will go to Learning Griffith.
Okay, two additional very good points. One is around managing your time and scheduling and access to when you should be at different things. And the other is having an historical record and being able to go back and look at things that have occurred in the past. Now, two good points there.
Yeah.
Now, Emma also mentions that it's good for attendance issues. Yes, being able to identify when people have done things. Very useful here at university in that we can see when students first look at a course, and we can then see those that haven't logged on and looked at a course, and we know that they probably haven't engaged and need some reminders or some additional help. Of course, they haven't accessed the resources and have started engaging with the courses. And yes, the whole idea of accountability, in that students can still access resources and content even if they aren't able to attend either school or university. And the whole idea of I lost my assignment sheet, or the dog ate my assignment when I was going to submit it, and all those other things do become more difficult when everything's available online, and both parents and students can access and see what should be happening and help manage the learning processes more effectively. And yes, to a certain extent, it is a virtual university, though most universities try to combine the advantages of both, and we call that blended learning, where even our on-campus courses incorporate the use of a learning management system and the recording of lectures and sharing of resources, because a lot of the things that we learnt through doing online courses, where we first started using learning management systems, we found that those could also be very beneficial to students in face-to-face courses. And that's the whole idea of blended learning, where we combine the advantages of both. Now, Emma mentions that she found the online blackboards easier when she was an undergraduate. Now working full-time, she doesn't get the time to explore the sites as much. Yes, absolutely. And that can be one of the challenges of any online resource. It's so easy to provide lots and lots of resources that sometimes we lose sight of the purpose of those resources and the role of curation and selecting just what's most important, rather than providing access to lots and lots of opportunities and resources. And that is something that everyone's coming to grips with, particularly as now we're getting access to more and more really good resources. And the temptation is to make that all available and to share that. But at a certain point, it does become problematic. And Eric mentions that it really depends upon student motivations. No, absolutely. And that's the nature of any learning experience, particularly outside of K-12. In K-12, really, we can take responsibility for the motivational aspects to a large extent and pretty much force students to engage. At university, we don't do that. We actually allow students to fail. Where in K-12, we don't have that culture, and we take on the responsibility of helping students develop their own engagement with courses and classes. Okay, let's go back and have a look at a little bit more theory. So moving on from learning management systems, we've got a new idea, or reasonably new idea, called a personal learning environment. This is where, instead of just using the university's learning management system, you take responsibility for your own learning and you develop a whole set of tools and resources online that you use to support your own learning. Now, some of these might be things like Facebook accounts, where your class might set up a Facebook account and share resources and talk about your learning and use that to help support your learning. Or you might set up your own blog and keep a record of your learning and use that as a reflective process. Or you might communicate with friends and work together on assignments using things like Skype and other tools. And the whole point is that you've got access to lots and lots of tools and resources other than just the environment provided by the learning organisation, such as a Griffith, Learning at Griffith, or in Education Queensland schools, the Learning Place and things like that. And very often where these tools that are outside the learning management system are more effective, students tend to become more engaged with those tools because they've got more ownership over them. They're less supervised in those environments. And yes, Emma, Twitter can also be a very powerful personal learning environment where you can share resources and ideas and help support each other's learning. Very much in a different dynamic to the organisational managed learning management systems. And there is a fair bit of research saying that there's a move towards the personal learning environments and away from the learning management systems. And a number of new tools are being developed to try to support personal learning environments where students manage the environment themselves rather than it being managed by the organisation. Still fairly new area in that respect, but very much an emerging one. Any comments on personal learning environments? Does anyone else have any tools or approaches that you use to help support your learning other than Learning at Griffith? Yes, YouTube's a very good one, Eric. And that's one about 90% of our students in schools now do. I think the latest stats were about 85% of their learning is done through YouTube clips. It's a phenomenal figure. And students are really, really engaged with YouTube as a learning tool. And again, it's something that's not managed by learning management systems to a large extent, and ones that students have a lot of control over. Okay, so the next section is something that came about a few years ago, which is called Massive Online Open Courses. Now, these were online courses similar to this one, but they were offered for free. And they were done by some very large, significant organizations such as MIT and so forth. And they very quickly became very popular. Of course, you had very famous academics doing the courses, and they were set up so that they could have an unlimited number of students. And indeed, some of the courses got 50 to 100,000 students enroll in them. Very, very powerful approach, and it caused a lot of universities and other organizations a lot of worry. Of course, they saw that if this took off, everyone could start learning through these online courses that were being offered for free and not worry about going to university. There were really two types of online courses, though, that were called MOOCs, or Massive Online Open Courses. One was called the XMOOCs, which were very similar to this course, where you had a lecturer and he provided lots of learning activities and the students did those activities. But there was another type called the CMOOC, or the connectivist MOOCs, and these were much more, everyone came together and shared their ideas and learnt together through that sharing process. So a very different type of structure, but both of them very effective in terms of very large numbers of students engaging with them. Now they've tended to, they haven't quite continued on their rapid trajectory, and they're sort of not seen as taking over the entire learning space anymore, but they do offer a lot of interesting perspectives on where education might go into the future. So you could imagine, instead of every school having a teacher teach ancient history, you could have your very best teacher of ancient history do one big MOOC for every student across the entire country. And they could all participate in that MOOC. And likewise, another teacher could run the maths lesson on trigonometry for every student in the country, or indeed every student in the world. And this really changes the whole concept of education quite dramatically. Of course, MOOCs, as with any online course, don't offer all the engagement as face-to-face courses do, but there are a lot of people looking at different ways of totally restructuring our education system, both at school level and at university level, through the opportunities afforded with these online courses. And we're not just talking about someone doing a lesson on ancient Egypt just as their classroom. We're talking about someone like a team of 20 or 30 people with several $100,000 worth of video investment into making an incredibly good lesson on ancient Egypt. And if everyone was doing that for all the different topics, we could have a much more improved content and quality of the activities in these lessons. Now, we would lose the interactivity of individual teachers and the affordances they provide to engagement and interaction with students, but we may come up with a structure where we still have the teachers that become purely facilitators of students engaging with these online courses. And indeed, that's happening to a large extent in America at the moment, and in Canada, where I visited one city in Canada, in Vancouver, where any student had to be provided with the opportunity to take their course online with any teacher in their district, which is about 200 schools. So you could be studying physics in your school, and you know that there's a really good physics teacher 3 schools over. You've got the right to be able to still stay in your school, and indeed still stay in your physics classroom, but learn online with the teacher from another school. And that really changes a lot of issues around the identity of teachers and the role and relationships they have with their students. Yes, Emma, very important for rural and remote schools. And indeed, throughout Queensland and Australia, we're doing a lot of good stuff with distance education using online models, particularly providing opportunities where there's not a specialist teacher in a school to be able to still learn online, even though they're still supervised in their school with a classroom teacher, but that teacher doesn't have the expert knowledge that's provided through the online environment. So a lot of interesting things that maybe emerging in education through the technologies of learning management systems and online courses and things of that nature. Okay, so with learning management systems, there's a whole range of technologies that support these. Now, you've been used to using Blackboard, which has been a learning management system that's been around for a long time. But there's a whole range of others as well. Moodle is a free open source one, which has been around for a long time as well, and it's an Australian one, developed by an academic who actually was a PhD student at the time in Western Australia, and he wrote his own learning management system, and it's been around now for 20 years and is really a competitor to Blackboard to many respects. But there's others. Sakai is one that was designed specifically around, well, it actually had two different versions. One was around collaboration and digital portfolios, and the other one was around use of social media and Facebook-like environments to promote learning in that space. Edmodo is another one. This uses what's called a connectivist pedagogical model, where very much around sharing of resources and sharing ideas and working together on projects. Canvas is another one. It has a whole range of different approaches, but it links in a lot with social media services and Google and Skype and Facebook and LinkedIn and all those to try to expand what's possible in a learning management system. So each of these have different advantages and disadvantages, but collectively they provide a whole range of different possibilities around the use of learning management systems to promote project-based learning and other approaches rather than just the direct instruction, which is supported by Blackboard as its primary pedagogical approach. So you can imagine a learning management system that is primarily focused around getting people into teams, managing them working on projects, identifying when things were due and when different parts of the project had to be completed, and then sharing the results of those projects and celebrating the successes and achievements of those groups. Okay, so any other questions about learning management systems or the various elements that we've been discussing in that respect? What you should be thinking is, are any of these technologies applicable for your potential questions for your assignment 1? Funding is an important issue, and particularly for the learning management systems, they really do rely upon a fairly expensive funding process, although there are open source tools such as Moodle, but then you've got a fair bit of investment needed still in maintaining and managing the servers and all the resources that go on them. So learning management systems are not cheap, and that's one of the advantages of the personal learning environments where you use social media tools and drop boxes and sharing tools to achieve the equivalent of what a learning management system does, but without the expense of maintaining your own learning management system. Of course, the disadvantage then is, though, that you're reliant upon a whole lot of tools that rely upon advertising as their revenue sources and things of that nature, which in some contexts, particularly in K-12, we don't like to do. Okay, I'm not too sure what you mean by making it easier to attain. If you want to just explain that while I set up the last. Okay, in terms of funding. Yes, in the main, funding, learning management systems is something that centralized bodies do like. Any large organization that likes to be in control of the organization likes learning management systems. Of course, they can see and manage everyone that's enrolled and restrict access to certain people and provide access to others. And it's a good tool for managing people and resources and the learning process from that perspective. Not particularly a good tool for supporting the learning process, but despite its name, learning management systems have never been particularly useful in supporting the learning. They've been great in supporting access to resources and other things that help make learning easier, but actually supporting the learning process is more complex. And that is where some of the newer tools that promote a constructivist approach or project-based learning approaches tend to be more focused on that, where direct instruction processes, such as Blackboard, where really you're just presenting information and then quizzing people on how well they've learnt that information and memorized it, are not the pedagogical models that we'd like to have as the mainstream in our schools or our universities. So there's always been that ongoing tension. But let's now look at the final section for this evening, which is one of the advantages of using a learning management system is we can start getting access to lots and lots of data about students and what they're doing. And with this data, we can analyze it. And this is called learning analytics. Yeah. So when you enroll, there's a lot of data that's collected about you in terms of your name, where you live, all that sort of demographic data. But also we can collect data about your previous learning and your previous success at learning. How well you did in other courses, how well you did at school. All of those elements can be incorporated in, and then we can start making decisions based upon that data. So you can imagine a student coming into high school from primary school. They could collect information on how well they did in the national testing, how well they did in their classroom testing, their behavior management, whether or not they've been in trouble, whether or not they've been expelled, or other things that have had. And all of this then gives a picture about that student based upon this data. But using the data is where the technology now comes into place. And there's various elements that we can explore around using data. At the top level, we've got the national collection of data. This is things like NAPLAN and the big demographic censuses and things like that, where we get a picture of how many students are going to school across the nation. Where are they sort of located? Maybe their attendance at school, how many students are missing days of school. And all of that's collected at a national level. But then we sort of go down to a middle level. We're getting information about school report cards, how well students are going over an entire year, and we're collecting general information about how they're going in terms of their learning. And then all the way down into your classroom, you might do a quiz to see whether or not students have learnt a particular concept in a lesson, or there might be a formative task you give students to complete an essay, and then you have a look at their essays and see how their learning is going around a particular topic in a formative way. So lots and lots of processes where we can collect data about students' learning. And some of that we can then provide feedback on. And the feedback loop then hopefully improves their learning. Of course, we give them advice on how they can then make adjustments to ensure that they are learning more effectively. So learning analytics has a whole range of processes. Now, you may not realize it, but we apply a lot of these to our university students. Not so much in the postgraduate courses, but certainly in our undergraduate courses. We run a whole lot of learning analytics over students in their first year, and we identify students based upon profiles of who are likely to be at risk of failing or dropping out in their first year, and we assign them special advisors to then give them assistance based upon those learning analytics. And over time, that's being developed more and more as we achieve better models of students, so that we can then tell who needs assistance and provide that. But that can be problematic. We can also do that in schools, and one of the outcomes of that is around streaming, where, say, in the early years of high school, we assess students on their mathematical ability or their science ability, and we put them in different classes depending upon that assessment. And that can then limit or promote students' opportunities throughout their future learning experiences at school and even into university. So sometimes learning analytics and making decisions about students based upon data can be positive, but there is also the potential for it to be negative. If you're identified as a student that's not performing well, you may be pigeonholed into a particular category of student and your opportunities may be limited. Of course, the idea is to provide you with extra support to address any problems that you may have. But if it just happened to have been a bad week that week and you did poorly on your tests, or you're a late developer and over the course of the next year or two you suddenly became very engaged with learning around particular topics, your opportunities may be limited by your previous performance. Some of the negatives, but lots of positives as well. We also do a lot of learning analytics around social engagement. So having groups of students working together on teams and group projects, we can use social network analysis to work out which students are contributing to assignments and group work, how much interaction they're having, down to how much activity they're having on discussion boards, who they're talking to on discussion boards, the networks of students that they're engaged with, and a whole lot of other aspects that can be explored through social network analysis. So lots of things happening around learning analytics. At this stage, it's mostly around predicting problem students that are going to need extra support, but people are working quite strongly on having much more complex results from learning analytics. Indeed, the new NAPLAN online testing process will do a similar thing, where the quiz questions will be adjusted based upon students' initial performance. So if they start getting questions wrong, they'll then be given easier questions to work out the level that they're most appropriate at. But if they start getting all the questions right, then the questions get harder and harder until it identifies the particular level of performance of that student. But that means that the software has to start making a whole lot of decisions around what opportunities to present students in terms of their assessment. And that has positives and negatives. Does anyone want to have any comments or questions about that so far? Yes, it'll be interesting to see what happens with NAPLAN. Of course, there are purported advantages. One is that the results of the NAPLAN testing will be made much more quickly back to schools and the students, so that then the learning processes can be adjusted to address students' needs, which currently aren't being done because it takes so long to get the results back of the NAPLAN testing. And yes, there is issues around internet access and those elements, and that is a challenge. Also an opportunity though, in that because there's such a desire to have national testing online, it means that they'll have to make sure that every school's internet connection is sufficient. But it is one of the reasons why it was problematic. Okay, so there's another aspect of learning analytics, which is what's called data mining. This is where we get access to and look at the data that we've collected on students. So we could make predictions, as I mentioned, about their future performance. We can also cluster students, like get all the students that are interested in different things together in groups. We can identify the relationships between students and teachers, or even around interest areas and so forth. We can make system models to make predictions on students, and we can develop up a system model around individual students or classes, and then think through, okay, what if we do these sort of things for this class? What might be the outcomes, and make some planning based upon that. And there's lots of ways we can then have examples of that. The quizzes that you do in this course could be used for data mining and to work out certain things about you. How often you access the website or the videos, how often you watch the videos. And indeed, the technology is down to the point where we can actually measure how long you spend on a particular web page or on a particular digital book. And with some new technology coming out around the use of the video cameras on computers, we can actually measure how much time you're spending looking at different parts of a page and whether or not you're just glancing at the page or whether or not you're reading things in detail and engaging with the material. So there's lots of new technology coming in around that. We can also collect data around your participation in lecture discussions and online tutorials and the general discussion groups, etc. They've also got a whole lot of stuff coming out around test taking, where we can use cameras on people's laptops to make sure that if you're taking an online test, that it's you doing all the work on the test, and also even down to keystrokes. And we can actually identify whether or not it's the same person typing in information in a chat system by how they actually press the keys, and whether or not they've got someone else doing it for them. So there's lots of interesting technologies coming out around security for online assessment. But this is all fairly new stuff, but it's an area where a lot of large educational organizations are very interested, because they can see large-scale changes being able to be achieved by having evidence supported by statistics to make decisions. There are challenges and problems with that approach, but it's an approach that a managerial perspective on education is very interested in. And I've given you a number of other examples there about some of the positives that can be developed from that. Okay, so a few other things that you need to be aware of. One is around the open data movement. This is the idea of trying to make this sort of information freely available to anyone that wants it, rather than simply being collected by particular organizations and used for their own purposes. And a number of councils throughout the world have found great advantages in making data open, particularly in the United Kingdom, which has done a huge work around this. But also here in Australia, we've got a number of open data movements where the information is made available. In Queensland Education, for example, all the data on student attendance at schools, down to individual schools, is all made publicly available, and anyone can have a look at that. You may be aware of the My School website, which collects all the data about individual schools and their NAPLAN results and makes that available to parents. So parents can make decisions on which school to send their children to based upon the statistics that have been collected about schools. Now, we actually do less of a harsh job at that than they do in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, they've got a process of inspecting schools, and they actually do a rating of each school and each subject within the school, and that's all made public available. And indeed, it's possible, if you know who the teachers are in various schools, to then tell how individual teachers are performing compared to other teachers. So yeah, while My School seems fairly onerous here in Australia, it's not as problematic as some other countries have in terms of their data collections. And then, of course, Google is collecting huge amounts of data, as is Facebook and many other online services, and using that and selling that to companies and so forth. Okay, a little bit there about NAPLAN, if you're not aware of this strange thing we keep talking about. This is the national testing program for years 3, 5, 7, and 9 in literacy and numeracy. There's also a computing equivalent to NAPLAN where students are tested on their computing skills, but it's only done in year 6 and only done at a random number of schools. And I've just given you a process in there whereby you can analyze NAPLAN results very quickly using a particular pattern process, which quickly shows you which students are doing well. In this case, Sally's doing well across the board. Bob is doing well in everything except for question 4. And that then identifies that most students are doing poorly in question 4. And that would be the thing then that the teacher should focus on, followed by questions 3 and 2. And poor old Jason's doing badly in everything. Okay, so with all of this data, how can it be used by teachers to improve the learning process? Because that really should be our main focus, rather than the administrative processes or other purposes that data can be used for. So generally there's different types of data. There's demographic data, which is about the students and socioeconomic status and their languages and their gender and all that sort of stuff. But then there's data on students learning, how well they're actually learning the concepts that they should be learning. There's also data though on school processes, so the types of instructional strategies used in schools, the resources that they might have available, the types of classroom management processes they use, the relationships among various groups. And then there's also data on perceptions, how well we think about various things, whether or not we think a school is going well, or whether or not we think students are doing well, whether or not testing is good or bad, and things of that nature. Now, Emma uses a program created to help understand the NAPLAN results. Yes, and that's provided to all schools and districts, and there's a whole range of tools that help teachers understand the data and make sense of it. And it's good to see that they're being better used now. The process I presented a bit before was just a simple one used when you don't have access to that sort of tool that helps you analyze the data in more detail. But it's a very important step. When NAPLAN was first introduced, most teachers didn't know how or were familiar with how to actually analyze the data. And so it seemed very decontextualized. The entire purpose of NAPLAN was to provide advice to teachers to improve their teaching. Now, it has been used for many different purposes, some of which don't support that approach, but that was the original intent. And it is hoped that the online NAPLAN testing will take things back towards it being a tool, a diagnostic tool for teachers to use, rather than being a collective data tool to analyze how all schools are going across the nation. The advantage of differentiation means it's going to be harder to make judgments on the data as indicative of the average of all schools across the nation, rather than on providing advice to individual teachers and schools. Yes, Eric, that is the point. To provide timely advice so that teachers can change their practice. Now, ideally, it should be so that they can actually change their practice for individual students. Because of the timeliness of the data coming back to schools, often it was just that they could change their collective practice from year to year. But the original intent was to provide specific advice on what each individual student needs to address, and in time for teachers to be able to make those adjustments and to support those areas of need. Okay, so there's a whole range of different uses that we can use data. It can be used to uncover problems that we may not have realized were happening in a school, such as it may be that for some strange reason, lots of year 8s are not turning up to class on Thursdays. And then something can be done to try to work out why that may be. Maybe they're all going off to the release of the new movies every Thursday. But something that can be identified by looking at data collectively. It can be used to convince people of the need for change. And that may be something you need to consider when we come to your second assignment, when we look at ways of getting people to come on board for change process. Data can be a very effective tool to convince certain people of that need. It can be used to confirm or discredit assumptions. So we may just think that all the students from the Pacific Islands aren't doing well in school. And we can look at the data and see that, no, that's not the case. There are certainly some that aren't, but there are also some that are doing better than students from non-Islander backgrounds, for example. Data can be try to identify specific areas of need. So it may be working out that there's certain classes where they do need extra resources. The principal might have thought that all the teachers had lots of technology resources, but it may be that just 3 classes have got all these laptops, and that there's another 5 classes where they've only got very few technology resources. They can be used to prevent an over-reliance upon standardized tests. Of course, we may be able to use data to collect specific information about individual students, rather than just have all the students do the same testing process. You can evaluate program effectiveness by looking at pre and post sets of data before they do something new and after, and see whether or not that intervention has been positive or negative. It can provide feedback whether or not we should keep doing what we're doing. So if you don't have data to support things that are going well, then someone could come along and say, okay, we need to make a change, without really realizing that things were actually still doing quite well, and that the change may not really be needed. And can prevent quick solutions. Of course, generally, if you're used to using data, before you make a decision, you go and collect data and make sure it's based upon data, rather than just doing a decision because you're empowered to make the decision. And it can also make you more accountable and be able to respond to accountability questions. So if parents are complaining that students' results are going to go down because they're using iPads instead of pen and paper, and if you've got the data, you can say no, that there has been no change, or maybe an improvement. Or it may be you could identify that there's been a negative consequence of introducing iPads, for example. And then you could look at then ways of then addressing that, because you've got the data to say that, yes, there is a problem, and you need to then find a solution to that. And that builds the final one, which is you can build a culture of inquiry and continuous improvement through the collection of data. Of course, when you've got the data, you're then it's implied that you should be then making use of that data to make things better. And that's that whole culture of inquiry. And we'll be talking more about that in the last few weeks of the course. This is an Education Queensland process for informing practice and maintaining that constant positive culture of improvement. And you can have a look at that as a model. And finally, when you've got data, in order to convince people of how to engage with that data, or even to interpret it yourself, it's useful to turn that data into visualizations. Now, the simplest visualization we often have are tables and graphs. But we've also got things like infographics and other processes whereby we can have more complex ways of presenting lots of data in a way that we can engage with that data more effectively. And this is some examples of some infographics that are used and other tools that can be used to showcase data. And last little bit, back to learning management systems, we can actually collect lots of data through learning management systems and use these to show how people are interacting with each other. And also computer games are another great way of collecting lots of data and then analyzing that data and using that for various purposes. Okay. So as Emma rejoins us, that brings us to the end of that data section. Do we have any final questions? That's okay, Emma, I do understand. So we covered a whole range of different educational technologies in a bit more depth this week. So I just wanted to take you down this exploration. Now, it's only a few of the educational technologies that are available. As we saw when we looked at the Horizon report, there's lots of educational technologies, and many of them have got very strong possibilities for impacting upon our educational organizations in the near future. And for your second assignment, you're going to be choosing a set of these technologies and thinking about how to actually implement those in an educational organisation. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at mobile technologies and how they could be used in various contexts to improve learning. And then after that, we're going to get stuck into the processes of enacting change in an educational organisation. But any final questions on gaming, virtual worlds, learning management systems, and learning analytics? Okay then. Well, we'll finish up for this evening, and I'll see you again next week.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jason.
Okay then. Bye-bye.
Bye.